A brutal arrest in the dead of night. Two arrogant cops thought they were throwing just another helpless man into a cold, concrete cell. They mocked him, stripped his dignity, and locked the door. They had absolutely no idea they had just handcuffed their own precinct's worst nightmare. The rain over the city of Belmont was unrelenting, coming down in sheets that turned the asphalt of Harrison Boulevard into a slick black mirror. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Terence Rollins pulled the hood of his faded grey sweatshirt tighter around his head, keeping his head down against the biting wind. He had just finished a grueling 2-hour workout at a 24-hour boxing gym 3 blocks away. At 42, Terence was built like a heavyweight, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and possessing a quiet, heavy stillness. But tonight, he was just a tired man walking home in the rain, carrying a worn duffel bag over one shoulder. He didn't notice the patrol cruiser until its high beams washed over him, casting his long, distorted shadow against the brick wall of a closed laundromat. The cruiser slowed to a crawl, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Terence kept walking, maintaining his steady, rhythmic pace. He knew the unwritten rules of the street, especially in this district. You don't run, you don't stop abruptly, and you don't put your hands in your pockets. A quick chirp of the police siren cut through the sound of the rain. The cruiser's passenger window rolled down. "Hey, stop walking!" A sharp, nasal voice barked from the darkness of the car. Terence stopped. He turned slowly, letting his duffel bag slide down to his side. He kept his hands completely visible, resting them on the strap of the bag. The cruiser's doors popped open, and 2 officers stepped out into the downpour. Officer Bradley O'Keefe was a young, wiry man with a tight buzz cut and a restless, aggressive energy. His partner, Officer Simon Decker, was older, heavier, and looked thoroughly annoyed to be standing in the rain. "Where are you headed tonight?" O'Keefe demanded, shining a blinding high-lumen maglight directly into Terence's eyes. "Home," Terence replied calmly, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. He didn't squint or turn away from the harsh light. "Home where?" O'Keefe took a step closer, resting his right hand casually on the butt of his service weapon, a deliberate, practiced intimidation tactic. "About 4 blocks from here, over on Cedar," Terence answered. "Put the bag on the ground." Decker ordered, walking around the rear of the cruiser to flank him. "What's in it? Gym clothes, a towel, boxing gloves," Terence said, slowly lowering the bag to the wet sidewalk. "Officers, if I may ask, why am I being stopped?" O'Keefe scoffed, stepping into Terence's personal space. The cop smelled of stale coffee, cheap cologne, and adrenaline. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a string of burglaries in this sector. Tall, dark clothing carrying a bag. Now put your hands on the wall." Terence didn't move immediately. His mind processed the tactical situation, the legal framework, and the blatant violation of protocol happening in real time. Officer, a general description of dark clothing in the middle of a rainstorm does not constitute reasonable articulable suspicion for a Terry stop, let alone a search. "Am I being detained?" O'Keefe's jaw clenched. The arrogance in the cop's eyes flared into sudden violent anger. Cops like O'Keefe weren't used to citizens on Harrison Boulevard using terms like reasonable articulable suspicion. To them it wasn't a legal defense, it was a challenge to their authority. "Oh, we got a street lawyer here, Simon," O'Keefe sneered. "I said put your hands on the damn wall." Without waiting for a response, O'Keefe lunged forward, shoving Terence hard in the chest. Terence's heavy boots remained planted. He barely moved backward, which only infuriated O'Keefe further. Decker rushed in, grabbing Terence's left arm and twisting it violently behind his back. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Decker yelled, though Terence hadn't flexed a single muscle in defiance. "I am not resisting." Terence said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the agonizing pressure on his rotator cuff. "I am complying, but I am stating for the record that this is an unlawful detention." O'Keefe kicked Terence's legs out from under him. The big man went down hard, his knees slamming into the wet, unforgiving concrete. Before Terence could catch his breath, O'Keefe drove a heavy knee directly into his spine, pressing his face into a puddle on the sidewalk. The freezing water filled Terence's mouth. Cold steel ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting into the skin. "You have the right to remain silent, pal," O'Keefe whispered venomously into his ear. "I suggest you use it." They hauled him up by the handcuffs, nearly dislocating his shoulders, and threw him into the back of the cruiser. As the door slammed shut, enclosing him in the smell of old sweat and vinyl, Terence sat upright. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply looked at the digital clock on the cruiser's dashboard, 11:53 p.m. He memorized the car number printed on the dash. Unit 412. Up front, O'Keefe laughed as he tossed Terence's duffel bag into the trunk. "Burglary tools," O'Keefe said to Decker as they got back into the front seats. "I felt a crowbar in there. I only had boxing gear, Officer O'Keefe." Terence spoke from the back, deliberately using the man's name. "And there is a dashboard camera in this vehicle, as well as the intersection camera at Harrison and 9th. Both will show a clear lack of probable cause." O'Keefe turned around, his eyes wide, with a manic mix of amusement and rage. "You think anyone gives a damn what you say you're going to a cage? And tomorrow a public defender is going to plead you out to disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Enjoy the ride, counselor." Terence leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He let the silence stretch out, accompanied only by the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. Let them dig the hole, he thought to himself. Let them dig it as deep as they possibly can. Precinct 8 was a relic of the 1970s, a brutalist concrete structure that felt more like a bunker than a public service building. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a headache-inducing hum, illuminating a lobby packed with the weary dregs of the night shift. O'Keefe and Decker marched Terence through the double doors, frog-marching him past a row of holding benches. A few other officers looked up, nodded at O'Keefe, and went back to their paperwork. Nobody asked why a man in gym clothes was bleeding from a scrape on his cheek. Nobody questioned the excessive force. Systemic apathy hung in the air like thick smoke. They reached the booking desk, manned by Sergeant Bill Higgins, an older man with tired eyes and a drooping grey mustache. "What do we got, O'Keefe?" Higgins asked, barely looking up from his computer monitor. "Prowler, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct." O'Keefe rattled off seamlessly, reciting the lie with practiced ease. "Refused to ID on the street." "Empty your pockets," Higgins ordered Terence. Decker roughly unzipped Terence's hoodie and patted him down, pulling out a soaked leather wallet, a set of keys and a cell phone. Decker tossed them into a plastic grey bin on the counter. O'Keefe snatched the wallet and flipped it open, pulling out the driver's license. He didn't look at the credentials behind it, didn't notice the metallic gold card tucked in the inner sleeve. He just read the front of the license. "Terence Rollins." O'Keefe read aloud, tossing the license back into the bin. "Well, Terence, you're spending the night in the honeymoon suite. Let's go." They didn't process his fingerprints right away. They didn't allow him his legally mandated phone call. The blatant violations were piling up so fast that Terence was categorizing them in his head like a grocery list. Violation of Department Policy 402.1, failure to process property correctly. Violation of Penal Code Section 14, denial of legal counsel. O'Keefe grabbed him by the elbow and shoved him down a narrow, heavily scuffed hallway. They reached holding cell C, a 10 by 10 iron cage that reeked of urine and industrial bleach. O'Keefe unlocked the cuffs, shoved Terence inside, and slammed the heavy iron bars shut. The metallic clang echoed down the corridor. "Breakfast is at 6. O'Keefe grinned, tapping his baton against the bars. "Sleep tight!" Terence stood in the center of the cell. He didn't massage his bruised wrists. He walked over to the thin metal bench, bolted to the cinder-block wall, and sat down. Across from him in the corner, a man was sleeping off a heavy bout of intoxication, snoring loudly. The night dragged on. For hours, Terence sat perfectly still in the dim light. He didn't sleep. He watched the officers walk past the cell block. He listened to their conversations. He listened to how they spoke to the inmates to each other. He observed Sergeant Higgins sleeping at the booking desk. He noted the times the patrol officers failed to do their mandatory 30-minute welfare checks on the holding cells. By 4 a.m., the adrenaline of the arrest had faded, leaving a dull, throbbing pain in his shoulders and knees. But his mind was razor-sharp. He had spent the last 2 decades building cases, dismantling corrupt organizations, and holding the powerful accountable. He knew how the machinery of the law worked from the street level all the way to the governor's mansion. He had seen bad cops before. But to experience it firsthand, to feel the sheer suffocating helplessness that ordinary citizens felt when stripped of their rights, it ignited a cold, focused fury deep within his chest. At 6:30 a.m., the precinct began to stir. The night shift was exhausted and irritable. The morning shift was filtering in, carrying steaming cups of coffee and shaking off the rain which had finally stopped. At 7:15 a.m., the heavy steel door at the end of the cell block swung open. Footsteps echoed rapidly down the hall, sharp, authoritative clicks of high heels on the linoleum, accompanied by the heavier, hesitant boots of Sergeant Higgins. "I demand you open that cell immediately, Sergeant—" A crisp, commanding female voice echoed. O'Keefe, who was lingering near the coffee machine at the end of the hall, stepped forward. "Whoa, whoa. Lady, you can't be back here. Who are you?" Eleanor Stanton stopped in front of holding cell C. She was dressed in an impeccable charcoal pinstripe suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase. She was a high-powered attorney who charged $1,000 an hour, and her icy glare could freeze water. "I am this man's legal counsel," Eleanor said, turning her piercing gaze on O'Keefe. "And you are Officer O'Keefe, badge number 8492, is that correct?" O'Keefe narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, that's me. Your client is a violent prowler counselor. He's not going anywhere until his arraignment." Eleanor didn't even blink. She turned to Sergeant Higgins, holding up a piece of paper bearing a judge's official seal. "This is an emergency writ of habeas corpus, signed 10 minutes ago by Superior Court Judge Thomas Avery. The charges have been dropped entirely. Release my client immediately, or you will all be held in contempt of court." Higgins looked at the paper, his face turning pale. He didn't argue. He fumbled with his keys, walked past a stunned O'Keefe, and unlocked the heavy iron door of cell C. Terence stood up slowly. He smoothed out the wrinkles in his damp hoodie and walked out of the cell. He didn't look angry. He looked completely, terrifyingly in control. "You think you're pretty smart, getting a hot-shot lawyer," O'Keefe sneered, stepping in front of Terence to block his path. "You're just delaying the inevitable Rollins. I know your face now. Next time I see you on my streets, it won't just be a night in a cell." Terence stopped. He looked down at the young officer, his dark eyes locking onto O'Keefe's. "No, Officer O'Keefe," Terence said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "Next time you see me, you will be the one needing a lawyer." Terence stepped around the cop and walked out into the lobby. Eleanor handed him a heavy plastic bag containing his personal effects. "Are you all right, Terence?" she asked softly, as they walked through the double doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool morning air. "I'm fine, Eleanor," Terence said, pulling his cell phone from the bag and powering it on. "But this precinct is sick. It's rotten to the studs. O'Keefe is just a symptom." "The mayor's office has been calling since 5 a.m., Eleanor noted, opening the door of a waiting black SUV. "They are panicking. The official swearing-in ceremony was supposed to be a press event at 10 o'clock. "Cancel the press event," Terence said, sliding into the leather seat of the SUV. There was a freshly pressed, custom-tailored navy blue suit waiting for him on the back seat. "Call Commissioner Davis. Tell him I'm skipping the ceremony and assuming my duties effectively immediately." Terence looked out the tinted window, staring back at the grey concrete bunker of Precinct 8 as the SUV pulled away from the curb. "Tell the Commissioner I'm coming to work," Terence said, dialing a number on his phone, "and tell him to bring a lot of handcuffs." By 8:45 a.m., the sun had finally broken through the lingering storm clouds, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the steel and glass facade of Central Police Headquarters. On the 14th floor, Commissioner Richard Davis paced nervously behind his massive mahogany desk. Davis was a seasoned politician in a uniform, a man who survived by keeping scandals out of the headlines. Today the headline had just walked into his office. The heavy oak doors swung open. Terence Rollins stepped inside. The damp, battered grey sweatshirt was gone. In its place was a flawlessly tailored charcoal navy Brioni suit, a crisp white shirt, and a crimson silk tie. The brutal scrapes on his wrists were hidden beneath immaculate French cuffs. Only the small, dark bruise on his cheekbone hinted at the violence of the previous night. He carried himself with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who owned the room the second he entered it. Terence. Commissioner Davis breathed, rushing forward with his hand extended. "My God. The mayor called me at dawn. I am profoundly, deeply sorry about what happened at the 8th Precinct. It is an absolute embarrassment to the badge." Terence did not take the offered hand. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locking on to the commissioner. Davis slowly lowered his hand, clearing his throat awkwardly. "An embarrassment implies a mistake, Richard," Terence said, his deep voice smooth, but carrying the lethal edge of a razor. "What happened last night was not a mistake. It was a well-rehearsed, systemic operation of abuse. Those officers didn't hesitate. They didn't worry about cameras, protocol, or consequences. That tells me they have done it 100 times before. I assure you they will be suspended immediately pending a full review," Davis stammered, retreating behind his desk. "They won't be suspended," Terence corrected him, walking over to the window and looking down at the sprawling city. "They will be indicted, and I am not waiting for a review board to tell me what I already know." Terence turned around, his gaze piercing. For the past 15 years, Terence Rollins had been the most feared federal civil rights prosecutor on the East Coast. He had dismantled corrupt narcotics units in Chicago and indicted entire precinct commands in Philadelphia. The mayor had spent 8 months begging him to return to Belmont to take over the deeply troubled Internal Affairs Bureau. Terence had finally agreed, demanding absolute autonomy. His official swearing-in as the Chief of Internal Affairs was supposed to be a polite, televised ceremony at 10 o'clock. "The press conference is cancelled," Terence stated. "I am assuming command of IAB right now. Where is my team?" 10 minutes later, Terence stood at the head of a sprawling conference table in the IAB war room. Gathered around him were the 12 hand-picked investigators of the Special Investigations Unit. At his immediate right was Captain Sarah Buckley, a fiercely intelligent former homicide detective with a reputation for being incorruptible. To his left was Lieutenant Raymond Torres, an expert in forensic data auditing. "Good morning," Terence said, his voice commanding absolute silence. "As of this moment, I am your chief. We are not going to waste time with introductions. We have an active, escalating crisis at the 8th Precinct." He pressed a button on a remote, and the massive screen at the end of the room flickered to life. It displayed the dashcam footage from Unit 412, synchronized with the intersection traffic cameras from Harrison Boulevard. At 23:45 hours last night, this man was unlawfully detained, assaulted, and falsely arrested by Officer Bradley O'Keefe and Officer Simon Decker. Terence explained. Torres squinted at the screen. "Chief, respectfully." "That's you?" "Yes, it is, Lieutenant," Terence replied coldly, "which means we have absolute, unassailable first-hand witness testimony to pair with the digital forensics. Watch the screen." The room watched in heavy silence as the footage played. They saw Terence walking calmly. They saw O'Keefe initiate the stop without reasonable suspicion. They heard the audio clear as day as O'Keefe mocked him, shoved him, and drove a knee into his spine, while Terence offered zero physical resistance. Captain Buckley's jaw tightened. Textbook excessive force. No probable cause. They didn't even run your name through the database before they put hands on you. "It gets worse," Terence said, fast-forwarding the timeline to the precinct lobby cameras. "Observe the booking process. Sergeant Bill Higgins is the desk officer. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't log your personal effects into the secure digital ledger." Torres noted, furiously typing on his laptop. "He doesn't initiate a medical evaluation despite the visible facial laceration. And, wow, they completely bypassed the fingerprinting station. They just threw you in a cage, because they were lazy and because they believed they were untouchable," Terence said, leaning over the table. "They thought I was just a ghost in the system, a nobody they could break to meet a quota or feed their egos." Terence pulled a stack of heavily redacted files from his briefcase and tossed them onto the center of the table. "I spent the hours between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. observing the cell block," Terence continued. "I noted severe dereliction of duty across the board, missed welfare checks, falsified logbooks. I want a full audit of Precinct 8's arrest records for the last 36 months. Cross-reference every arrest made by O'Keefe and Decker, where the sole charges were resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, with no underlying felony. I guarantee you will find a mountain of false arrests just like mine." Captain Buckley looked up, a fierce, predatory smile forming on her lips. "We are going to gut that precinct, Chief. We are going to perform surgery." Terence corrected his eyes, locking onto the frozen image of O'Keefe's arrogant face on the screen. "Surgical precise and devastating. Here is the operational directive." Terence turned to the whiteboard and wrote out the immediate charges with rapid, aggressive strokes of a dry erase marker. "Warrants to be executed. Title 18, USC, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under color of law. State Penal Code 118, Perjury filing a false police report. State Penal Code 245, Aggravated assault by a peace officer. State Penal Code 236, False imprisonment." "Buckley, get the district attorney to sign off on these warrants immediately," Terence ordered. "Torres, gear up. We are going for a ride." At 10:30 a.m., the atmosphere inside the 8th Precinct was thick with the usual morning chaos. Telephones rang incessantly. Civilians argued at the front desk, and officers milled about the bullpen, swapping stories and clutching cheap foam cups of coffee. Officer Bradley O'Keefe sat at his desk, his boots kicked up on a stack of incident reports. He was bragging to a rookie cop about how he had handled a street brawler the night before. Across from him, Officer Decker was slowly typing out the fabricated arrest narrative for Terence Rollins, struggling to make the timeline sound plausible. "Just say he took a fighting stance." "Simon," O'Keefe laughed, tossing a crumpled piece of paper at his partner. "It ain't rocket science. Public defender is going to plea it down by noon anyway." Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the bullpen swung open. Captain Arthur Mitchell, the commanding officer of Precinct 8, stepped out of his office. Mitchell looked physically ill. His face was ashen, and he was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "O'Keefe! Decker!" Mitchell called out, his voice cracking slightly. "My office, right now." O'Keefe smirked, swinging his legs off the desk. "Probably want to give us a commendation for getting a prowler off the streets, Simon. Come on." The two officers swaggered across the bullpen, oblivious to the sudden suffocating silence that had fallen over the older, more experienced sergeants in the room. They stepped into Captain Mitchell's office, O'Keefe leading the way with a cocky grin. "What's up, Cap?" O'Keefe asked, casually, leaning against the doorframe. The door slammed shut behind them. Captain Buckley stood there, her badge prominent on her belt, her hand resting near her sidearm. Lieutenant Torres stepped out from the corner of the room, holding a thick manila folder. O'Keefe's grin faltered. "Whoa! B, what's going on here? Captain?" Captain Mitchell didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, looking like a man attending a funeral. The high-backed leather chair behind the captain's desk slowly swiveled around. Terence Rollins sat there. He was perfectly framed by the morning light streaming through the blinds. He looked immaculate in his navy suit, his hands folded neatly on the desk. He looked at O'Keefe with a cold, terrifying serenity. O'Keefe physically recoiled. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like a ghost. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Decker let out a strangled, breathless gasp, taking a panicked step backward, until his shoulder hit the heavy oak door. "Good morning, Officer O'Keefe," Terence said, his voice echoing in the small office, like the tolling of a bell. "Officer Decker." "You." O'Keefe stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, trying to reconcile the heavily bruised man in the wet hoodie with the impeccably dressed Titan sitting behind his captain's desk. You were the guy." "I am Terence Rollins," Terence said slowly, standing up to his full imposing height. "Chief of the Internal Affairs Bureau, and as I recall, you promised me that the next time I saw you on your streets, it wouldn't just be a night in a cell." Terence pressed a button on a small digital recorder on the desk. O'Keefe's own venomous, sneering voice filled the silent room. "You think you're pretty smart getting a hotshot lawyer. You're just delaying the inevitable, Rollins. I know your face now. Next time I see you on my streets, it won't just be a night in a cell." Terence clicked the recorder off. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. "You were right, Bradley," Terence said softly. "It won't be just a night. It will be years. Chief, listen. We thought you were someone else." Decker pleaded, his voice high-pitched and trembling. "It was dark. It was raining. You fit the description. Do not insult my intelligence, Simon." Terence's voice cracked like a whip, the sudden volume, making both officers flinch violently. "You didn't have a description. You had an ego. You saw a man walking quietly in the rain, and you decided to break the law to prove you were the law." Terence walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from O'Keefe. The young cop was trembling, his previous bravado shattered into a million pieces of sheer panic. "You thought you were throwing a helpless man into a concrete cage," Terence whispered, leaning in so only O'Keefe could hear. "But all you did was lock yourselves in." Terence stepped back and nodded to Captain Buckley. "Bradley O'Keefe, Simon Decker." Buckley said, stepping forward with her handcuffs drawn. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault, filing a false police report, and deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The click of the handcuffs ratcheting around O'Keefe's wrists sounded exactly like the cuffs he had slapped on Terence 12 hours earlier. But this time it was the sound of justice snapping shut. Torres secured Decker, who was openly weeping. Strip them of their badges, their weapons, and their union cards, Terence ordered, not taking his eyes off O'Keefe, and walk them out through the front doors. I want every single officer in this bullpen to see exactly what happens to those who desecrate the shield. As Buckley and Torres marched the disgraced handcuffed officers out of the office and into the shocked silence of the precinct bullpen, Terence turned to Captain Mitchell. "Sergeant Higgins is suspended without pay, as of this second," Terence commanded. "I have 40 IAB auditors moving into this precinct in 20 minutes. Every arrest, every report, every piece of evidence logged in this building for the last 3 years is going under a microscope. If you have any rot in your house, Captain, I will find it. And I will burn it out." Terence didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing with absolute authority. He walked straight through the bullpen, parting the sea of stunned police officers. He pushed open the heavy front doors of the 8th Precinct and stepped out into the bright, clear morning. The rain was gone. The storm was over. But for the corrupt cops of Belmont, the real hurricane had just made landfall. Did the look on O'Keefe's face, when the chair swiveled around, make your jaw drop if you felt the incredible rush of justice when Terence turned the tables on those corrupt bullies? Smash that like button. Share this incredible story of a brilliant mastermind taking down the system.